In 2019, we saw the launch of the EU's Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy AI, the G20's AI Principles, and the G7's International Panel on Artificial Intelligence. And those complement all the existing private and third sector think tanks such as AI Now, AI for People, AI for All, Partnership for AI, the Algorithmic Justice League, and as the salesman promised, much, much more. And yet I have asked at the outset whether this 2019 might not be the year of unethical AI ethics. This, of course, is meant as a provocation, but it is also meant to prompt an intuitive misunderstanding that I hope will underline the morally impoverished language of this good deficient historical moment. What I mean to claim is that this will be a year of bad AI ethics. I have little doubt that it will be ethical per se. Will it ever? There will be codes and protocols and debates and white papers and consultations and proclamations galore, and all will acritically affirm the particular goodness that emerges from the perspective of some prevailing, powerful, historico-cultural us. In case it has managed to slip someone's mind since Philosophy 101, ethics is definitionally bound to an us, a particular us. Ethos is a habit or accustomed or to be accustomed to. Ethnos is our particular tribe, people like us. And both words derive from the same root, etho, to be accustomed to set as one's own. Now, this is purportedly a paper questioning the viability of AI ethics, and it is. And yet I'll make very few references here to AI. I think that's the way it must be. The problems I wish to raise regarding this year's trend, this year's vogue for AI ethics, has much more to do with the condition of the world generally than with any particular technological application in it. This is to say that AI ethics, pertaining to the particular prevailing world system and culture embedded moral like us, good like we do things here and now model, is poisoned from its 0 point. None of this year's ethics of AI initiatives will challenge or even contend with the qualities of the prevailing general model that make our entire ethical paradigm toxic. Worse, AI's technical constitution builds upon and exacerbates precisely that model's worst features. And Enrique Dussel, whose ethics of liberation has had a major influence on my thought and to whom I turn more than once now, writes that, quote, the only ethics worthy of the name is that which is capable of critically judging the totality of a system of ethics. That is the hinge on which all these lofty ambitions to make 2019 the great year of AI ethics will fail, by which I mean, of course, that they will fail from a materials perspective. They will be really bad. They'll be just fine, thriving even, from the perspective of their achieved discursive legitimacy within the dominant ethical regime, that is, the good like us paradigm. Dussel's insistence on assuming a critical ethical stance is crucial here. In fact, Dussel always uses a hyphenated critical ethical to refer to the sort of ethics that is, well, worthy of the name. This has little to do with continuing education-worthy edX courses on critical thinking that are, not unlike AI, all the rage. It is not merely a formal analytical project, and it is not simply a one-and-done denunciation or deconstruction. Quote, if the good is finite, if it is impossible to achieve a perfect work, and it is clear that he thinks that it is, I agree, ethics teaches us to be attentively critical and in permanent struggle. Those who install themselves in the power of the good are already evil, and the prevailing good has already become transformed into that which is not good. And so I say, in their system-bound acriticality, 2019's lofty slate of AI ethics projects cannot do other than fail and ever fail. What I set out to do in the rest of this paper does incise upon the operativity and goodness of AI itself, but I issue my fundamental critique to what I will refer to as the technic order and its techno-ethical paradigm. To understand what I mean with these terms, I ask that you call to mind Ellul's technique, and most importantly, its autonomous, self-justifying, and always expanding natures. Man in this picture does not master technique, but rather is mastered by it. Technique must reduce man to a technical animal, the king of the slaves of technique. Technique begets technique, and so assumes a self-evidentiated necessity and naturality, becoming so natural and so autonomous, in fact, that it appears beyond ethics. In this sense, it becomes more like rain or rainbows than like atom bombs. With this sketch of a background in place, I can present my bifold thesis. First, I claim that no AI ethics can be good because, in its perfect technicity, AI aborts at the very moment of its inception the person to person response, the gratuity, the mystery, and the exteriority that are preconditions and features of the good ethical relation. And second, in any case, no AI ethics will be good because all of its ethics makers are already subsumed by a pre existing ethical system that is constituent to the hypermodern capitalist technical world system, and that ethical system, I say, is rotten. These ethics makers will not be good doers or good makers, but only norm makers. Having been correctly, that is, ethically, formed within and conformed to that system, they become, quote, the kind of men necessary for its, the technical system's, ideal of service. To defend these two claims, first I will review a handful of ideas from three figures whom I think we can correctly call critical ethical thinkers, people who can help us to avoid the system-soaked errors of, well, most variants of ethics that make their way into the respectable ethical discourse space today. Those are Levinas, Illich, and Dussel. Second, I will discuss what I refer to as the algorithmic paradigm and its technoethics, which is not only the ethics of AI or C-coded algorithms, but also the ethics of the already algorithmic world in which AI finds a ready place. And finally, I'll inspect one example of how AI appears in this toxic technoethical world. So part one, some critical ethical foundations. First, I turn to the thinking of Levinas, Dussel, and Illich as I try to describe the toxic character of a regnant system-bound and embedded ethics, which I call the techno-ethical paradigm, that makes it into something like an abortifacient to the good, rather than a guarantor of it. What I want to claim here is that there are preconditions and conditions for goodness that this our technic system violates and or impossibilizes, and this renders that system bad. Levinas gave language and currency to an ethics rooted in the face of the other, and I think this is a good place to begin recovering something like an originary good. For him, transcendence, and with it, let's say, our possibility for accessing the good, is necessarily aligned with exteriority, with what lies outside myself, and which it will never be possible for me to fully comprehend. This exteriority for Levinas is the person, the other, and it is her face that commands and obligates me to her. The other is different, radically different, ultimately and fundamentally and unknowably different, and it is only in this radical difference that I myself can be constituted. Still more exactingly, the presence of this other, quote, who implicates me in human fraternity and commands me on the basis of his or her transcendence, is above all the foreigner, the widow, the orphan. Surely this language will beckon some other moral codes with which you might be familiar. For Dussel, this special other is the victim, in whom an ethics of liberation is grounded and who merits a preferential obligation. Importantly, Levinas's responsibility is not imposed by an almighty or by a king, but rather by the presence in my presence of the other herself. This is very similar to the ethics that Illich portrays epitomized in the Freedom of the Samaritan encounter, the Samaritan response. It is not merely that the Samaritan responds to the injured man, to whom the good people of the world had averted their eyes and retracted their bond, but that he responds to the injured man in the particularity of that man's need at that moment, in that place, with reference to that man's own being, and across the boundary of a prior established we, that is, of a prior rooted ethics. The Samaritan did not arrive with a performance protocol or an evaluation checklist or an ethics board approved plan or even a general rule that he must follow. He had not even any foreknowledge upon setting out that morning that he might have met an injured man along the side of the road. His response to the injured man was just that, a response. And to name the two themes that Illich picks up on throughout his work, that response was gratuitous, It was not obliged by any legal or social code, and it was contingent. He might have responded, he might have not, he might not have happened upon the scene at all. Gratuitous and contingent. I think these are two good themes for framing Illich's ethics, which might best be called, precisely, an ethics of response. This sort of ethics is not at all compatible with either technique or administration, which I would say are the two braces of this hypermodern world. It cannot be programmed or prescribed or managed or measured. It is not subjectable to protocol or procedure, and it certainly cannot be encoded in an algorithm. Illich's entire body of work spins around the corruption of the good, and we locate in his reading of the Samaritan encounter both that corruption, in this case an institutionalized ethics that makes the good people of the world move to the other side of the road and continue on their way, and its radical alternative, the response. In a similar way, Dusser's ethics of liberation recurrently emphasizes the perversion, the corruption inherent in any consolidated ethical system, and in particular the especially wicked achievement of the actually contemporarily dominant ethics. While the prevailing ethical systems and its norms, actions, and institutions claim to invoke just those ethical principles necessary to put its goodness claim into effect, alas, it does not. Those people who comply with it, and all the more so, I say, those who do not merely comply with it, but who assume active positions in its replication and enforcement, for example, those who sit on ethics boards, it, quote, insists on legitimizing the traditional fulfillments of the system, the good, that produces victims, and so positively act, to transform that good into absolute evil. This is precisely Illich's articulation of the corruptio, the institutionalizations of all goods perverts them. Part 2. Algorithmic Ethics. Contrast these Levinasian, Dusselian, Illichian models of face-to-face or response ethics with any ethics at all that might be achieved in the technic order. Again, if we accept wholesale Ellul's vision of technique, this may be an impossibility, and technique might simply operate beyond ethics. This would be neither here nor there, if not for the facts of the autonomy and superiority of technique. Technique circumscribes man, not the other way around, and it's man that I'm worried about. For Levinas, it is the face of the other that demands a contingent, particular responsibility and response. In the technic world, it is technique itself that demands a response, and the response demanded is to be efficiently productive, punto. What's more, this response is not mine to freely give or to withhold, but rather encoded in the procedure and protocol that define every aspect of this technic order. No responsibility, no response can emerge from the iRobot, nor can it emerge from the technique-inscribed person. The mystery and unknowability of being and exteriority are expunged in the same moment that the face of the other, and my encounter with it, with her, are revoked from this ethical order, which is, of course, the moment in which the ethical order becomes techno-ethical. This seems damning enough in the formal sense, but what seems worse, much worse, is the badness that the world has already achieved in just this techno-ethical direction. I will call this the achievement of the algorithmic paradigm. If the gratuity of the Samaritan's response, or the gut-compelled response prompted by the face of the other, is what makes those responses good, well, I must say that such responses are already largely beyond the possibilities of persons acting in this real world, of persons subsumed by the practice, the paradigm, and the ethics or non-ethics of technique. The really troubling aspect of the algorithmic paradigm is that it has modulated us. We, people, are ever more algorithmic in our thinking, acting, doing, and being, and consequently ever more constrained and restrained in our possibilities for encounter, response, gratuity, mystery. Medical schools ingrain decision tree logic to produce doctors statistically more effective and efficient, but altogether incapable of encountering persons who are deviant bodies, or relinquishing their claimed dominion over nature, mystery, and fortune. Decision makers in any sector can't proceed without an Excel-compiled cost-benefit matrix and probabilistic computation of success. Even love comes with a how-to. Again, Ilul. Technique, as the universal and autonomous technical fact, is revealed as the technical society itself, in which man is but a single, tightly integrated and articulated component. Illich wrote of this in what might be called a lamentation in terms of systems. But what of the person who has himself been swallowed by the world conceived as a system? Again, the impossibility or minimized capacity of the I robot to enter with an other in an encounter is an important enough problem of the techno-ethical paradigm. But I think you can see that we have bigger problems than this to grapple with. In any case, setting aside theory, where and how can we see the obliteration of the other and of the encounter and the orgasmic pinnacling of techno-ethical operation? Well, for example, I would say that we can see it in the hyper-codification, bureaucratization, systemification of ethics itself. My God, at my alma mater, we now boast a new Center for Business Ethics, sponsored by Deloitte. I even managed to find an ethical code for ethicists, which I suppose is only logical insofar as it is ethicists' job, I guess, to reinforce the ethical paradigm, which is, I think you have gathered the thrust of my claim, bad. We can find everything in this algorithmic, technified ethics, from streamlined flowcharts to simplified red light, green light directives to affirming proclamatory jargon as meaning spare as, say, that used in mindfulness training or in HR jingo. What is clear is that this ethics is bounded by and within the paradigm that created it. And this paradigm is about efficiencies of processes and systems. It has nothing to do with faces. Part 3. On negating the victim with Facebook's suicide algorithm. Alright, all this about technique and the technification of ethics generally. Well, what about AI then? My main objective here has been to mark the distinction between a Levinasian ethic of encounter, which I will say is good, and the techno-ethics of the contemporary techno-world, which I will say is, in denying the face of the other, bad. In AI, we find something like the culmination of the bad. With AI, it is not merely possible that people become faceless others, swallowed by the world conceived as a system. It is impossible that they not be. And at the same time, precisely because people generally have been swallowed by the world conceived as a system, they encounter the prevailing ethical system, techno-ethics, with a wholesale uncriticality that renders naturalized and unquestionable the goodness of the good as defined by that system. That is, I can distinguish two aspects of fault here. The first is the total disencounter with the other, an inability to receive and respond to the face of that other, particularly the other who is a victim of the prevailing system. And the second is that, acritically bound to and participant in the prevailing ethical system, people are unable to question the goodness of its good, even when there is material evidence that that good, in fact, produces victims, in fact, is evil. Consider the Facebook suicide algorithm. In brief summary, Facebook leapt onto the suicide prevention bandwagon with pompons and kazoos, and AI, and 2.4 billion active users, and a whole lot of money. It has developed and implemented a machine learning trained algorithm that determines, on the basis of a user's post, whether he may be suicidal. A flagged post undergoes human review, and the reviewer assigns it to one of three outcomes. In the most serious, quote, we contact appropriate local resources, that most likely is the police, quote, to promptly attempt to intervene and remove any potential risk of death. There's only one published scientific article on this application, and its analytical weakness and shallow-end-only reflexiveness makes it into an easy target. What is clear, however, is that the weakness of this article, most importantly its weakness in a critical ethical sense, but also in a merely discursively unaware one, only reflects the same weakness that prevail among, well, the people of this corrupted techno-world more generally. The analysis operates at a wholly technical level, asking how questions, which is the best technique for identifying suicidal people, while ignoring the substantive questions that are more properly and fundamentally ethical. Is suicide bad? Should I intervene in a suicider's act? And ignoring the world beyond Facebook into which its algorithmic decisions erupt. What exactly does intervention entail? Is that good? And failing altogether to see the victim it produces. Will this action be good for the other involved? Does this action correspond to the will and to the good of the other? While the ethics makers of the prevailing victim-producing ethical system will tell you, well, yes, of course it's good. How could it not be? This, of course, is the naturalized goodness of the perverted or victim-producing good. Now, I wonder how many of you have an idea about what happens then. Well, I could not find any reports about what happened then to any of the 100 or so Facebook users the company boasts having helped through its AI-capacitated intervention strategy. I was able to find plenty of reports about what happened then to people who called one of the dozens of suicide hotlines, which are, incidentally enough, trendy enough to generate plenty of "please don't kill yourself, call us now" ads in my web browser as I go about researching this paper, and which I would generally drop into my very large file on the violence of the good. Instead of turning to the experts consulted in Facebook's boastably ethical project, I think it's better to hear from a few of the people who have been helped following such calls. One writes, "Police arrived at my house, took me from my home against my will, threatened to tase me, didn't allow me to take my phone or notify any of my friends or family, then locked me away in a hospital for 96 hours. Another writes, "This put me $8,000 in debt, wrecked my credit and the remainder of any of my finances. That was almost 2 years ago, and I still haven't been able to bounce back. Frankly, I don't know if I ever will." I add, I doubt it. A third writes, "And thus, this is my advice to most people. Just bury it deep down inside and don't tell anyone." Those seem about true and right to me, and I'm going to claim expertise here on the violence of the good. In 2014, while living in Britain, I suffered a disastrous medical encounter, but as a skinny-bodied woman, they resolved the problems very straightforwardly, by classifying me as anorexic, that is, as mentally ill. What happened next is uncommunicable, and in any case, to put unbelievable words to an unbelievable series of events in an effort to make believable the badness of this ethical system's regnant good is no doubt an ill-fated project. You can find that effort in my Knowing Violence works if you're interested. Here, I'll take a shortcut. Over a period of 10 months, they accidentally killed me, and then they willfully disabled me physically, legally, socially, and economically. They imprisoned, or, quote, hospitalized me, with no foreseeable means of escape, no foreseeable means of exit. In order to escape, well, I escaped, literally, and I fled the country and lived on the run, again, while physically and economically disabled, for 2 years. In the time since, I have not recovered any semblance of a good existence, and in fact I do not believe this is possible. The relevant point here is that Facebook's boastably ethical suicide prevention apparatus is achieving something similar. Those people it, quote, helps will be rounded up by the police, dropped into a white room behind 5 locked doors, and forcibly drugged. They will certainly be forever scarred, and if they're unlucky, most of them will be, they will earn a mental illness label that prejudicates the rest of their existence. If they live in a country with socialized medicine, they will likely find themselves trapped in a bureaucratically inescapable system, a system that also entails their enclosure in a physically inescapable place. Again, I invoke a certain expertise when I say that living is not always or necessarily better than not living. I would love to see some victim-present research on what happened then to all those unfortunate souls that Facebook and its boastably ethical suicide algorithm program have helped. But we'll never see that. No one seems even aware of the possibility that this great techno-ethical advance has produced victims. Of course not. There's no space, no possibility in this ethics to encounter an other, a victim other, and to respond to her. There's space only to implement systems, make probabilistic risk assessments, and follow the algorithmic protocol. How ironic, then, that I can use Facebook to illustrate the face-negating power of AI and of the techno-ethical system in which it lives.